Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us, and welcome to this CoinDesk webinar on ICOs and regulation, brought to you by Start Engine. With all of the talk and statements by regulators the world over the past few weeks, the timing of this conversation couldn't be better. And to discuss it today, we have a panel of crowdfunding experts with impressive experience, both on the entrepreneurial front and on the regulatory side. I'd like to start by introducing Howard Marks, the founder and CEO of Start Engine. Howard, hi, and welcome. Can you give us some background on Start Engine, when it got going, what its objectives were at the beginning?
Sure, absolutely. Start Engine's mission is to help entrepreneurs achieve their dreams. We got started when the Jobs Act was put in place in April 2012, and since then we've helped over 150 companies raise capital using the Start Engine platform over the internet, and recently a number of ICOs as well.
How did you get involved in the cryptocurrency world?
Well, I've been an entrepreneur for 35 years. I was fortunate enough to start Activision Blizzard, which is a Fortune 500 company, and my journey was in the game industry. And if you know the game industry, the idea of cryptocurrency is very natural to our business because we have internal currencies inside of the games. And when I started Start Engine, I decided I'm going to help entrepreneurs achieve their dreams. And I read a bulletin that was issued by the SEC regarding the DAO and the ICO of the DAO, and that intrigued me enormously. That was last summer. And based on that document, I decided, you know what, I think the ICO business is going to be enormous, and I want to help them get out of the shadows and bring them into a marketplace that is highly regulated, because it will help grow the business tremendously, much bigger than it is today.
Now I'd like to introduce Sarah Hanks, who's the CEO and founder of CrowdCheck. Sarah, can you tell us what CrowdCheck does and how it got started?
Sure. Like Howard, we were founded in response to the Jobs Act in 2012. We offer a complete suite of legal, compliance, and diligence services for all forms of online capital formation, whatever kind of security you're offering, from old-fashioned shares to new-fashioned ICOs.
Previously, you were an SEC attorney, if I understand correctly, and general counsel to the Congressional Oversight Panel, and you're also co-chair of the SEC's Advisory Committee on Small and Emerging Companies. So you have an almost unique bird's-eye view on the SME financing landscape. Was it that drew you to cryptocurrencies and tokens, or was it personal interest?
Yeah, I am a huge securities law nerd, and anything that is new and interesting, especially when you're trying to apply the old established rules to new things, is just automatically interesting. It was a natural outgrowth. It's a funding mechanism used by early stage companies, and we help early stage companies, so just happened kind of organically.
I'd also like to introduce Scott Purcell, who's the founder and CEO of Fund America and CEO of Prime Trust. Scott, can you fill us in on what those two companies do?
Sure thing. As with Sarah and Howard, we've been building these companies actually since November of 2011, when it was the Entrepreneurs Access to Capital Act in the House of Representatives before it went to the Senate and became the Jobs Act. So been doing this for a while. Fund America provides a suite of technology, investor transaction technology, broker-dealer compliance technology, and syndication technology. It provides AML, KYC technology and services, escrow software, and a variety of other things for the industry. It's a lot of the plumbing that all of the crowdfunding portals and brokers need, many of which in this industry are our customers. Prime Trust is a chartered financial institution. It's a trust company. It's a bank, according to OCC definitions. And it serves a variety of purposes. Most notably in this industry, it does a lot of escrow work for Reg A, Reg CF, Reg D, Reg S, and other types of offerings.
That's a bit of an alphabet soup of regulation. For our listeners who aren't familiar with what they do, can you give us a brief summary of what Reg A, Reg CF, Reg D, and any other applicable ones mean?
Sure. I'll start with the easiest one. That's Reg A, Reg D. Reg D is the way everybody's raised capital historically for decades. The tweak to it in the Jobs Act, before, if your company needed money, you couldn't tell anyone who you didn't already know. You had to have a substantive and pre-existing relationship with somebody before you could tell them that you wanted money, or someone that you know had to make a warm introduction to somebody in order to do that. So it was very constraining. The Jobs Act allowed for general solicitation. In other words, you could have a blimp drop, circling the Super Bowl and drop leaflets on the crowd saying, "I'm raising money," and that's called the new 506C exemption for Regulation D. There are some other requirements of that, but we're not going to get into the details here. But it's actually a very cool thing. That's Reg D. Reg A allows you to raise up to $50 million. They're calling it, a lot of people call it a quick IPO, but the majority of Reg A's that are successful are not listing their shares on NASDAQ or any other exchange. They're simply using it to raise money from non-accredited investors as well as accredited investors, that the shares are freely tradable or exchangeable after sale. And Reg CF, which Howard's company is the leading crowdfunding portal in the country, Reg CF allows people to raise up to $1 million from non-accredited or accredited investors. And you have to file with some paper with the SEC. Of course, the problem, and this will get into our discussion today, is the trading. If you issue securities on Reg CF or Reg D, you can't just put, even if you're issuing coins instead of stock or bonds, you can't just put them up on an exchange and allow them to be traded. That's illegal. There are restrictions on that. So we're going to get into that. But that's the overview of Reg AD and CF.
No, thank you for that. You're also very active in crowdfunding self-regulation. Among other roles, you're chairman of the Oversight Committee of Crowdfunding Best Practices. Is that right? How has crowdfunding self-regulation changed since you first became active in the field?
Well, sadly, we hoped that we would be able to get self-regulation for this industry, but that didn't work out. CIFRA was a great organization, which Sarah's been part of as well, and Sarah and I have worked together on many, many papers. We helped provide a lot of input to the SEC and to FINRA as they were crafting regulations, but the reality is we weren't able to establish an SRO, a self-regulatory organization, for this industry, and instead it's fallen under the purview of the SEC mostly, and also for regulated entities under FINRA.
Howard,
it's been fun.
Well, thanks for that. Howard, back to you a second. Talking about the Reg CF, as Scott mentioned, Start Engine is one of the leading Reg CF portals. How does that affect the ICO space?
Well, it is a great regulation for ICOs, and here's why. ICOs are built on communities of people. And when you have a company that is a blockchain company and you want to offer a service, you need tens of thousands of people to use it. And if you can only sell to wealthy people, which is what people call in the ICO world the private sale, these are accredited investors, wealthy people, you're limiting your numbers into the hundreds, not the thousands or the tens of thousands. Well, regulation crowdfunding will allow a company to raise up to $1 million a year to as many unaccredited investors as they want. There's no limit on the number of people, and it could be 10,000, it could be 1,000. The only limit is the amount of money you raise. It's extremely easy to put in place. It can take a week, 2 weeks, whatever you want, and it works great. There is a restriction to it, which is what Scott was talking about, the 1-year trading restriction. But after the 1 year, it is freely tradable.
And in your experience, has the $1 million limit been a barrier, especially given the size of ICOs that we've seen recently?
Not really, because if I looked at CoinDesk, you did a survey of the ICO space, and most ICOs, in terms of volume of number, have raised under $1 million. But what you can do with the regulation crowdfunding is you can put in place a Regulation D, which Scott was talking about, in parallel. So the wealthy people will go into Regulation D, and the non-accredited investors will go into the regulation crowdfunding. The two together can help you raise millions of dollars. And that covers the vast majority of all the ICOs.
And which is easier in terms of process for an issuer?
I would say both of them are easy to do. You still need a good attorney, and a securities attorney, preferably someone who understands this space, but they're pretty easy to put in place. And if you have a very short timetable, you can actually use regulation crowdfunding, Regulation D, for a very short, 1 week, 2 week period of time to get in place and go live.
That's really short. Is that with all the paperwork and everything?
Yes, because what happens is Start Engine actually does the filing automatically with the SEC EDGAR system. So the only thing a company needs to do is fill out the fields. That's all they have to do.
That's like filling out a form, and then you can raise your million or 10 million or whatever it is, depending on the reg that you're choosing.
Well, for regulation crowdfunding, it is filling out a form, and for Regulation D, you're actually creating a different document that is prepared by the attorney.
Okay, this sounds simpler than we all had feared. Does the Reg D also have a trading limit in that you can't trade for a year?
Yes, it has a 1-year restriction under Rule 144. Yeah, absolutely. But again, you have to understand that under Reg D, a lot of companies have put restrictions on the trading of their securities, and that's prior to the ICO world. And the ICO world today, when they see this, they don't have to put those restrictions, and they can say, look, after 1 year, these can be freely tradable, which, by the way, seems to be the direction the industry is going in.
Sarah, it must have been really frustrating for you, being a lawyer, with deep knowledge of the crowdfunding sector, to see the flood of ICOs that were so blatantly not complying with the unwritten rules at the moment of financial common sense. When did you start to realize that this was going to be a big problem?
Actually, I would push back on the unwritten rules. The rules have always been there, and the rules have not changed at all. And it was kind of amusing, because we'd look at these things and go, we don't know what you think you're doing, but whatever you think you're doing, that doesn't actually work. And we'd see these references to do an ICO instead of an IPO, and these aren't securities, and we go, yeah, no, that's not going to work. And so a lot of it was just the whole of CrowdCheck sitting around going, the world is going crazy.
No, we're missing something here.
Yeah, and people are just sort of making this stuff up. We are seeing a return to sanity in terms of people realizing, yes, what you are offering is securities. The securities laws have not changed, and they do apply. And if you want not to be sued or subpoenaed by the SEC, you might want to think about a bit of compliance there. So we started to see it really last summer was when we started getting very puzzled about why things weren't happening. And one of the things that, if you work with the SEC, in general, they move pretty slowly to catch up with developments. By SEC standards, what we're seeing now is within 6 months of realizing that something was going wrong, issuing massive numbers of subpoenas. This is the SEC moving pretty fast, and I think we should all assume that this will continue, that they're trying to send a message. But we're it's not even a year since this started to become obviously a problem.
You're right, and although it seems slow as we've been reading the news, looking back, we've come a long way in a year. Do you think people have got the message yet? Are you seeing a change in perception, or are there still some holdouts that think that we're exempt because we're a new technology?
I think that there's still a few holdouts. I think people are certainly getting the message, and the people who've got the message best are those who have received subpoenas, because there's nothing that concentrates the mind like having the regulatory authorities knock on your door. I think people are realizing, and what we are seeing it is a couple of different things that we've noticed over at CrowdCheck. And number one, a focus on compliance and approaching us to help them comply. And then secondly, one thing we've noticed is the SEC is also focusing on anyone who's looking to take advantage of the bandwagon without jumping on it. So, for example, you say, we are an iced tea company, but we're looking into the blockchain. Or we make cars and we're going to issue an ICO. When the SEC sees that, clearly there are some triggers, and they've got a list. It's obvious that if you mention blockchain, bit anything, ICOs tokens, you are going to get super reviewed when you go through their process. So it's been a very interesting development, and to the advantage. I mean, I think it's good for the industry. People need to focus on what they're offering and having some certainty as to what they're promising their investors.
And the cleansing effect as well will be definitely positive for development. How scary is it to get a subpoena from the SEC? We see a lot about the SEC, they're just investigating, they're looking for information, there's nothing to worry about. How scary is it really?
I've never had one, and I hope I never do. I've practiced for 25 years. I would be absolutely fill in your expletive here, scared. I mean, this is a serious thing, and it's also a very expensive thing. I mean, even if you are absolutely innocent, engaging someone who knows what they're doing and who can see you through the SEC litigation process or investigative process is incredibly expensive.
Through the lawyers' fees as well as the time it would take of the management team, I imagine, right?
Yep.
Scott, how did you get interested in cryptocurrencies and ICOs? Was it a personal discovery for you, or was it through clients, work, contacts, your business? Scott, you there?
Sorry, I had it on mute.
I've done that too.
The very first article that I read about blockchain, which is a while ago now, really piqued my interest and got me excited because, blockchain isn't crypto. Crypto uses blockchain, right? Everybody knows this. Blockchain is a ledgering technology. What's interesting is that from accounting, record keeping, bookkeeping, securities, shareholder registries, whatever, we've been using a ledgering system that was popularized by the Medicis in the 1400s, two-column system. So after 600 years, it's nice to see something new come along. And it's really, really exciting as to the disruption and the things that it can do. In terms of crypto, I am not exactly an evangelist for most of the current coins, but the use of crypto, the ability to issue tokens instead of stock or instead of bonds, the ability to change the landscape for how securities, because those are securities, how securities will be traded is very, very exciting. And so we as a financial institution have to be very, very careful about what we do in this space right now, but we're taking baby steps into it, and we're working with Howard a lot on this. We're excited to be part of it.
Howard, what do you think the main impact of cryptocurrencies will be? Apart from the ICO field that you're very active in, where do you think cryptocurrencies are going to take finance?
Well, my opinion is that cryptocurrencies are a true democratization of capital. This is the first time really someone can have control of their own assets, because most of the time if you have money in the bank, it's actually your money, you're the beneficiary, but it's actually the bank that owns the money. And the same thing with stocks. They go into street name, and you don't have that stock certificate of the old days in your hands. And cryptocurrency gives you this idea that you can have control of your assets. Now, this is great news if you like control. Not so great news if you lose control, because at that point you don't have any remedies. But I think it's fundamentally liberating people. And it's captivated so much imagination around the world that I think the real good news about this whole cryptocurrency is that you got tens of millions of people who are enthusiastic about finance right now. They want to own coins. They want to trade them. They want to be investors early on into new projects. This is actually an amazing sign, which is validating what we've been doing previously to ICOs.
Where do you see the ICO impact hitting, I guess, more deeply?
Well, I think the ICO is a new form of raising capital that is very compelling to people. So I think the ICOs have a great opportunity. And so I've renamed ICOs ICO 2.0 just because I want everybody to understand that the old ICOs, which is just a utility token, sold as an investment, but no regulation around it, it's just not going to work. It's not going to work in the United States. It's just not going to work in any country that has a real Security Exchange Commission type of organization because they're there to protect investors. Now, 2.0 means if you use regulation, you're allowing the investor to make an informed decision, which is actually a good thing.
When you say not going to work, because the regulators eventually are going to clamp down?
Well, it's an obvious.
What do you mean by not going to work?
Right. What I mean by not going to work is that on a legal basis, it's not going to work. So if investors lose money, they can easily go to their regulator, complain, and the regulator has a requirement, an obligation to defend them, to represent them in their best interest, because that's what a regulator is. If you look at the SEC, they have 3 mandates. One of the mandates is to protect the investor. And so what they'll do is they'll go to the SEC, the COB in France, wherever they want to go and complain. And then it's bad news for the company because they may have to do a full rescission, which is giving all the money back because it was not properly raised. That's bad for the entrepreneur.
And so it comes down to trust in the vehicle and the mechanism.
Well, the trust is a difficult question. The key here is to use the right regulation with the right attorney and the right platform to help you raise the capital, because then you understand that you have done everything by the book. So if things don't go well, which happens, by the way, in new companies sometimes fail, sometimes don't achieve their goals, then you're from a regulatory perspective, you have done what you have done, and the investors can certainly complain, but they cannot make a case of securities fraud.
Yeah. And so again, for this to become actually accepted and widespread, the trust factor needs to be there.
Well, here's what I see. I see the ICO marketplace growing tenfold only if it's using the proper regulation. And why? Because with the proper regulation, you now see more investors feeling comfortable to be a participant in this marketplace, and you'll have some institutional investors comfortable. It's just going to grow the business. It's no more a thing that is just interesting, like utility token. It's captivating people's minds, but there's a lot of problems around it.
Yeah, you're right. Sarah, pulling down on, again, Howard's emphasis on this being sort of an investment vehicle, investors, could you jump in with a brief summary of what would make an ICO a security in the eyes of the regulators?
Yeah, brief is always going to be a challenge here, but basically,
you can write it.
Yeah, with SEC, with U.S. securities rules, and I should point out that the rules have to be complied with at both the federal and state level, and the definition is not necessarily the same at both the federal and state level, because every state's got its own rule. Yeah, it is. Watch out for Washington State, which has a different definition. But really, what you should be looking out for is if somebody is investing in, quote, a common enterprise, like with a bunch of other people, and they are expecting that the profits that will come from that investment is going to be from what other people are doing. That's a really sort of almost facile definition of what makes something a security. The problem with some of the definitions I've seen online and some of the discussions is that it's like that old story of, like, the group of blind men who've come across an elephant and they all think it's a completely different creature. People are, celebrities especially, are looking at different bits of the various tests, and there are a few, that are used to define securities, and they're going, oh, well, my thing is not a security because people are going to make money through trading, and that means it's not a security. And that's usually a complete misunderstanding of the various tests. So bear in mind that there are different definitions at the federal level and the state level. Bear in mind that there are different tests. And so, I've seen a lot of celebrities talking about the Howey test. Not the only one. There's a few different ways of defining whether something's a security. And
what are some of the other ones?
Yeah, well, the Reeves test, which is probably to give it the most scary gloss. It's basically, if it looks like a security, if there's a family resemblance to other things that are securities, it's a security. And really, it's a question of the combined knowledge of all of the courts as well as the SEC is. You need to go through piles and piles of case law. Basically, a security is what the regulators say it is, if I want to sort of take it at its most facile level. And then also, a security is what plaintiffs' lawyers say it is. Because just to add to what Howard was saying earlier, I mean, the people that you might want to be the most scared of in this market is not the regulators, because they can't sue everybody, and it's in their own interests to pick and choose their cases and enforce on the basis of sending a message. Whereas a plaintiff's lawyer has every incentive in the world to bring class action suits against anything that might look like a security. And
the SEC can be fairly scary. SEC has to be a lot more careful, I imagine, because they don't want to lose a case. So they'll be more
Correct.
picky on who they go after, whereas class action suits don't have that restriction.
Mm-hmm. Yep, that's absolutely right.
And can you call the SEC and ask them, hey, do you think mine's a security?
I sometimes joke that the response you're most likely to get from the SEC is, your lawyer gets paid an awful lot more than we do, so ask your lawyer. And there's
no hotline or anything.
Yeah, unfortunately. I mean, the answer from the SEC is always going to be, that is a case-by-case analysis, and we're not going to spend time looking at every single little security. I don't think that in general they would be open to doing a no-action letter, which is one of the ways that you can go to the SEC and ask for an interpretation. It takes an extraordinarily long time to get a no-action letter. I've seen some folks go, well, look, here's Company X has asked a question on March 21st, and here is the answer from the SEC on March 22nd. What you don't know is how many drafts of the question went through the SEC. And I've got to say, the last no action letter I got from the SEC, it took literally a year to get. Wow. So they're probably not going to answer, and if they did, it would cost you a long time and a lot of money. So compliance is just so much easier.
And they'd probably insist that you comply anyway, right?
Well, once they've come to, unless you get a read from the SEC, which, by the way, is the way that it works is based on your representation that your lawyers have said you are not offering a security. So the first point is you've got to get your lawyers to be confident enough in a letter that they're producing to the SEC to say something's not a security. Not going to be a lot of that. So unless you can get your lawyers to sign off, then the SEC to sign off that the thing you've got is not a security, kind of easier just to make sure that you sell it in accordance with the securities rules.
And you've still got the class action suits to worry about, yeah. So it
Correct.
looks like digital tokens in the US anyway, or at least most of them, will be required to behave like a security and do the required registrations. Scott, in your opinion, do you see the ICO field becoming very much like the IPO field, or do you think there will always be very different market characteristics and clients?
That is a large question.
Absolutely.
and a little loaded. An IPO historically is done by a company who has filed a full registration statement, which is an S1 with the SEC. It's incredibly expensive, incredibly time intensive, and they're subject to Hart-Scott and a bunch of other regulations. It's the reason why we've seen a decline in IPOs in this country for a long time. It can take you $2 or $3 million a year to maintain your public registration status just for the filings and the audits and the things that you have to do. The Jobs Act helped mitigate some of that with some of the rules, but it's still very expensive. Now we've had Regulation A, which allows people to raise capital up to $50 million and provide a registration statement, a lighter registration statement than a full S1 to the SEC, be subject to lighter regulations, but have freely tradable securities by both accredited and non-accredited investors. So a lot of people are calling this a mini IPO. It's not exactly right, but for term of art, it works. On top of that, a few people, a very small group of Reg A issuers, have gone to NASDAQ or OTC and listed their securities. Most famously, Howard's very first Reg A, Elio Motors, did that, listed on OTC very successfully. We were part of that as well, along with broker-dealer W.R. Hambrecht. But it's not really an IPO. Most of these are freely tradable, but they're not going on an exchange. Same thing with Reg CF securities. After a year, a non-accredited investor can sell it to anyone they want. But again, is that an IPO? We're stretching the definitions of that. Sarah could certainly weigh in on the regulatory aspects of what is an IPO. I'm really just looking at it in terms of what the common man perspective is and the reality. But the whole ICO exchange capability will in the future, right now I believe most of it's being done improperly, but it will in the future, I think, seriously disrupt the status quo of stock exchanges, which is kind of cool.
In what way?
Makes it a lot easier to trade it. Right now we have essentially a monopoly or duopoly of stock exchanges where almost everything happens. This is going to create a number of exchanges where people can buy or sell securities without going through the cumbersome process of depositing shares with a broker-dealer, getting exceptions from transfer agents, and doing everything that's required. It just makes it a lot easier. It reduces friction. The biggest gating factor, besides the securities regulations, which are daunting, is investor education. People are used to buying stocks or bonds, but to convince a new investor to buy a coin instead of a stock, and here's how you do it, and go set up a wallet and do this and do, it's changing behavior. So there's a huge education that needs to happen for the mass market. But I think that'll happen, and it's exciting.
And changing behavior also leads to a whole lot of questions about why things are structured the way they are, and that might change the way the current exchanges work. Do you see the current exchanges perhaps waking up to this impending change?
Did you see Barnes and Noble start an online bookstore when Jeff Bezos started Amazon?
Yes.
Typically, no. People focus on their entrenched businesses, I think. You saw Amazon or NASDAQ getting involved in blockchain, but they don't view this as a serious threat.
It'll be interesting to watch this space. The exchanges on which the tokens trade, do you see them needing to, will they become regulated like the current duopoly that you mentioned?
If tokens are securities, and most of the SEC would say they are, as well as I think most securities attorneys, then the trading of them requires a regulated entity. And since none of the exchanges are currently regulated, some of them are making application, like T0 and others, which is great, but they're not through that process yet of becoming an ATS or becoming an exchange. So the trading of those is currently, to the best of my knowledge, still not being done legally. And in fact, because of state blue sky issues, anyone selling shares to anyone in Florida, New York, California, or anything else, that's an illegal transaction. So it's a mess right now and needs to be sorted out.
Pretty scary mess as well. Now, you mentioned T0. Howard, T0 is a start engine company, right? It listed, you did the first ICOs that you did. Is that correct?
That is correct. And T0 is a regulated ICO, which means an ICO 2.0. They're using the Reg D Rule 506C for raising capital directly from accredited investors. And for those listeners, an accredited investor is someone who makes basically $200,000 in income in the last 2 or 3 years, or has a couple $300,000 and has $1 million outside of their home. And that's what is considered accredited, and that is what they're using to raise capital.
And how long before they can fulfill that function, the need for a regulated token exchange?
Well, T0, what is so exciting about it is that they own a broker-dealer and an alternative trading system, which is ATS, and that is really, in my opinion, the way forward in the future for companies to trade their tokens on the marketplace, because it's fully regulated. It looks at all of the different fraud cases in securities, and some of them are called pump and dump. People are familiar with it. Front running, insider trading, all of that is considered by the broker dealer, which is T0, to make sure that the trading is fair and well organized.
Do you see the bottleneck of lack of regulated exchanges and the need for securities to trade in regulated exchanges? Do you see that as affecting liquidity?
Well, liquidity is the real key out of the entire conversation here today, because the reason most companies who are doing ICOs today want to do utility tokens is because they want to be able to tell their investors, hey, by the way, it's going to be on this exchange, that exchange, and you'll have liquidity, which is what investors really want, because frankly, the typical accredited investor has to wait 5 to 7 years for a return on their capital if and when they get their capital back. The idea that you can invest in an early stage company and the next day sell them for 5 times your money is pretty exciting to people.
Yeah, well, it's probably a year given the non-trading requirement. Is that right? But even a year is less than what they usually have.
Right, exactly. Right now utility tokens are issued and they are traded the next day. The reality is this: the marketplace is going to change. With the 2.0 ICO, they're going to have restrictions. Now, what Scott was talking about, regulation A+ is really the gold standard. It takes some time to get it qualified by the SEC, but once it's qualified, all the shares are freely tradable. And that, to me, is extraordinary. Now, the question is, where do you trade them, right? And so you have companies such as T0 and Start Engine and Templum have said, hey, great, we're going to be offering these kinds of opportunities, and yet none of them are really live, and obviously they will be live. It's just going to take some time, and people have to be patient.
Yeah, let me a couple of things on that since we're talking about liquidity. One is, remember, it's only liquid if there's somebody willing to buy it. As a lot of companies on OTC and other stock exchanges show, they get put into the pink sheets. There's not a lot of volume. if you had shares in that company, you wanted to sell them, there's nobody there to buy them, so there isn't liquidity. And that's true for ICOs as well. Just because it's on an exchange doesn't mean it's going to be liquid, unless somebody's making a market in that security, in that token. The other problem with exchanges is securities issued pursuant to Regulation D, Regulation CF, and Regulation A Tier 2 are exempt from state blue sky on the sale of the securities. However, they're not exempt from state blue sky on the resale of the securities. Mm-hmm. So you can raise capital from anyone you want in any state you want, no problem. But if that person then, they hold for a year, they fulfill their requirements or whatever, and they go to a token exchange and want to sell it, that token exchange may not be able to permit it because the security, that token, is not blue skied in New York or in California. It would be illegal for them to effect that transaction. And this is going to be a whole new level of complication that people are going to have to work through getting the state blue sky filings done.
This is fascinating. They're not quite as liquid, this instrument, as we thought. Sarah, can you talk us through what the blue sky laws mean, what they are for our listeners who aren't familiar with the term?
Sure. So to build on something I said earlier, which is, you have to worry about both the feds and the states. As Scott has pointed out, this applies in secondary trading as well. And every state has its own set of rules, which are all slightly different from each other, governing the initial issuance of securities and then trading thereafter. One of the basic principles of securities law is every purchase or sale of securities must be registered or exempt at both the federal and state level. And so you find an exemption for the primary offerings like Regulation A, Regulation D, Regulation S, Regulation CF. But then, of course, you need it for the resale. At the federal level, strangely enough, it's pretty easy for resales. Anyone who is not an affiliate or an underwriter is able to resell freely. But then, as Scott says, at the state level, everybody's got their own different rules. And so you could have a situation where the secondary trades that happen on a stock exchange are what we call preempted. So the rule is, if these things are listed on a stock exchange, only the feds and not the states get to govern how they will be traded in the secondary market. Don't have preemption for secondary trades of non-listed securities. And so the blue sky laws are going to include things like you can only trade securities, sell securities, if you fall within one of these exemptions. You haven't done it very much recently, or you're selling through a registered broker-dealer, or you're selling a security that's listed in a so-called securities manual. And you've got 50 states and a couple of extra jurisdictions there, each with its own combination of those restrictions. And the exchange or ATS or whatever has to go through all of those and work out what state is the transaction happening in, which means you've got a problem with anonymity here, because you've got to know, where are we selling into, and therefore you've got to know where the guy who's purchasing is, as Scott pointed out. And then you've got to work out what exemptions from state blue sky do we have for that transaction. So, Scott is absolutely right. Not that there is a liquidity problem for anybody who's not a listed, who's not a registered stock exchange. So all those ATSs, even if you're an exchange and you become compliant and you become registered with the SEC as an ATS, if you're not a, quote, stock exchange, you've got to deal with those state securities laws for secondary trades.
My head is spinning with all of this. Is there any way around this? Say I want to issue an ICO. What would I do to be able to comply with the blue sky laws?
Unfortunately, they're not optional. So,
Okay.
if you're within the jurisdiction of the U.S. Authorities, which means you're using what we call the jurisdictional means, which is the phones, the interstate highways, the internet. If you're using those things, the U.S. authorities have jurisdiction, and so the only way that you could avoid all of this stuff is to go and live somewhere else and be a non-US person with a non-US company issuing non-US securities to non-US investors that don't touch the United States. That's the only way you're going to really avoid any of this. And we've seen some of these cases. Sorry.
Go ahead. I'm saying, you go ahead, seriously.
Yeah, we have seen some companies in the U.S. say things like, "Well, I founded a Cayman company," and okay, that's adorable. You founded a Cayman company. That's lovely. You now have a Cayman company, but you're still sitting there in Massachusetts, offering securities to people in the United States. So not really very much help.
No, and I keep jumping in because I've got tons of questions on this. Do you worry that this might divert innovation to Europe, for instance?
I tend not to, because, I mean, Europe's got its own regulations too, even though they sometimes move slowly. And yeah, okay, you know, if everybody's going to go and live in Zug, then yeah, it's great. You have to like cheese, I guess, and you are not going to be able to sell into the United States. If you want to sell into the United States, then you're going to need to get to comply with U.S. regulations. Eventually, most of the Europeans are going to come to roughly the same place. And the thing is, where is most of the money? There's a heck of a lot of money in the United States. So, you know, if you want to avoid the U.S., you're avoiding a lot of the cash.
Do you see many cases of U.S. issuers only selling outside of the U.S.?
You do, but to the extent you are a U.S. issuer and you're sitting here in U.S. soil, whether or not your company is Cayman or Delaware, in order to comply with Regulation S, which is the rule that says the securities laws of the U.S. do not apply if you sell outside the United States. In order to comply with the requirements of Reg S and get true protection under that regulation, you are going to have to de-anonymize anyone you're selling to, because you're going to need to get them in their actual real name to represent to you that they're not U.S. persons and that they promise not to resell to U.S. persons for a year. So you can definitely escape U.S. securities law that way by totally avoiding the U.S. And by the way, you're going to have to geofence. You're going to have to exclude any mention of the offering in the United States, because Reg S says you can't, quote, offer the securities in the U.S., and an unprotected website is an offer of securities. So it's possible, but we've seen a lot of people who seem to think they're complying with Regulation S, and they're completely not complying.
Howard, let's talk about the non-accredited investors. I mean, a lot of what we've talked about is the full registration and lack of anonymity, but what about the non-accredited investors, which is most of us, let's face it? How can we get involved in a legal ICO?
Well, that's our specialty, and that's my passion, is to allow the Main Street investor to participate, and that's why Start Engine was created as a way to help entrepreneurs achieve their dreams by raising the capital directly from their communities. And so the Jobs Act changed everything. It's probably one of the most important pieces of legislation in the last 80 years for securities and for finance. Now, for the first time, a non-accredited investor, someone who's an ordinary investor, can invest in ICOs and in companies and startups simply because the company decided to use Regulation crowdfunding or Regulation A+.
And but that sounds, is that limited compared to the possibility of doing it outside of the US, for instance? If I were an issuer, I want to get an ecosystem started, for instance, much like Bitcoin and Ethereum did back in the day. I want to get my token in the hands of people who are going to help me create this ecosystem and build out the network. Is there any way I can do something like that in the United States?
Absolutely, but you have to comply with the rules of each country. So we've done that. We've done a survey of most important countries to understand their own rules and to comply with them. So there are some difficulties with each country, and one of them is Canada, which is our neighbor. And so yes, you can offer it to Canada, but you have to comply with their own rules in Canada. That requires quite a lot of work, which we've put that in place. We spend quite a lot of time, effort, and money to make sure we understand what those rules are. The United States, in order to take advantage of regulation, crowdfunding, or Regulation A+, you need to be an American domestic company. So Cayman Islands will not work. A lot of companies register in Delaware, which is great. And then they can take advantage of those two regulations, and then we help them raise money directly from the general public legally.
Okay, but then the limitations that the methods that you mentioned, which again, if I'm wrong, it's the Regulation A and the Regulation CF, right, that are available to non-accredited investors. They are limited in what they can raise, and so where I was heading was that would also limit the ICO issuers who would be interested in that method. Is that right?
I don't think it's a limit because you know what? Look, frankly, between you and me, 50 million is quite a lot of money. I mean, I think people just believe that everybody can raise 50 million, but that's not really the case. Let's face it. Very few ICOs have reached $50+ million. So your Regulation A+ gives you 50 million a year. I think that is quite a lot of money. Last time I checked, a lot of people are a little bit on the idea that, oh yeah, my ICO is going to be $300 million, but that's not reality. That's true for some, and that's great. But in reality, you can combine the Regulation A+ or the Regulation Crowdfunding with the Regulation D, and then at that point, the Regulation D can be whatever number you want, but only non-accredited investors. The good news is, by combining the two, you can satisfy two very important groups. You satisfy the group of non-accredited investors. That's your community. That's the people who are going to be using the service that is being offered on the blockchain. And then you can also combine the community of serious big money investors as well with the Regulation D.
And what about airdrops?
Well, the airdrops is going to be a big problem. So here's the thing. A lot of companies think, oh yeah, great, we're going to do a private sale, Regulation D, no big deal. We're going to raise our $20 million or $15 million, true. But hey, in order to entice those investors, we need to be able to say there's 10,000 people who are going to have the token. So, hence what Scott was talking about, which is liquidity, right? You can't have liquidity with 300 people. It's a little hard because most of them either are sleeping or awake at different times. So that's not going to work. So you need 10,000 people. Well, the airdrop was a beautiful invention, which is, hey, I'm going to ask people to join my channel on Telegram. I'm going to have them click here, click there, and then we're going to drop coins. Well, it turns out that is a securities transaction. I'm sorry to say to our audience, it's not going to work. So we found a solution. We found a great solution, which is you use the Regulation Crowdfunding exemption. And what you can do under Regulation Crowdfunding is you can drop to 10,000 people something's worth $100 each. That's $1 million. This is absolutely possible. But doing it the way it is done today is a violation of securities because the consideration being received, which is in kind, not in money, those clicks, those sign-ups.
Interesting. Scott, speaking of liquidity and also the exchanges, going back to something that I was worried about, the token exchanges are generally in exchange, token sales are generally in exchange for another cryptocurrency. So you buy a token in exchange for Ether or Bitcoin, for example. How does this impact the regulation, the medium of exchange used? Would it require additional regulation? Can it fit into existing rules? Where I'm heading is, do the payments, do the purchases need to originate in a wallet held at a regulated exchange, just as for a security today they have to originate from a bank account at a regulated financial institution?
That's a compounded question. Let me break it up a little bit. First of all, in any exchange of value for something, the currency of that, whether it's U.S. dollars or coins or gold or cattle or cotton or whatever, is irrelevant if the thing that's being bought is a security. So if you buy a security with Bitcoin or whatever coin, it's no different than if you're buying it with dollars. It is a regulated transaction and has to be on a exchange accordingly. The point I want to make on that real quick is I noticed in the ICO space people use the word exchange quite freely, and it is a good word to identify what that concept is. However, from a regulatory perspective, there are two kinds of exchanges. One is operating pursuant to Reg ATS, which is an SEC exemption that makes it easy for broker-dealers to effectively put up a website where securities transactions can occur. But the securities on that ATS have to be blue-skied in all the states the people reside in. There is also a filing where they can become a full-fledged security stock exchange, and that's like NASDAQ or NYSE. In that case, if you're listing securities on a stock exchange, then you do not have to worry about blue sky with all the states. They're exempt from that. So it's a very important distinction between the two. And to my knowledge, the T0 and the others who are creating exchanges for tokens, for securities tokens, are doing so under regulation ATS. And that's why, Sarah and I were both pointing out, it gets into the blue sky issues. And as Sarah said, the anonymity of the blockchain is a serious issue when it comes to blue sky, because you don't know where the buyer lives. And in fact, you could wind up with too many purchasers and blow your securities exemption on number of shareholders you're allowed in your company before filing a full registration statement. So it's a landmine. The anonymity of the way blockchain currently is a minefield. And personally, I think that eventually that part of the blockchain goes away. Their people will start issuing tokens that are not anonymous, that the blockchain will record who the owners are. That'll make things a lot easier.
Yes, definitely. Probably a lot more complicated as well, but definitely exciting the way this is going and the way it can clean up the sector. Sarah, a quick question for you, because we're running out of time here, but there are some rumors that ICO advisors and promoters are receiving commissions for promoting an ICO. Is that legal?
Well, it's legal under certain circumstances. I mean, if anybody is getting a commission based on the amount of securities that are being sold, then they have to think about whether they might be acting as an unregistered broker-dealer, and the SEC would have a problem with that. The other result of using an unregistered broker-dealer is that the transaction itself becomes rescindable, because the company has a problem too. And then the other thing that you really want to watch out for is the kind of the influencer thing, where you get your favorite celebrity and they're like, oh yeah, I'm investing in so and so coin. And he or she may also include some kind of statement as to whether or not their securities under Howey. But whether or not they give unsolicited securities law advice, if they are touting the advisability of buying securities or the existence of the securities offering, they have got to comply with Section 17B of the Securities Act, which says you have got to say that you are being paid, who is paying you, how much they're paying you, and the method in which they're paying you. So, I will get XEX number of coin because I am making this promotion. So, yeah, the whole celebrity endorsement thing is a bit of a minefield for the celebrities and the issuers.
Well, the whole thing does sound like a confusing space, but fortunately, we do have companies like all of you, like all of yours, to help us through this. I mean, personally, I can speak for our listeners, but my head is spinning, and I have a lot to go off and learn still. Where can our listeners find out more about this?
Well, it turns out Start Engine is organizing the ICO 2.0 Summit on April 20th in Santa Monica, the Fairmont Hotel. And I invite the listeners to consider either coming to it or watching the live stream, which is going to be all day. And it's startenginesummit.com for those who want to look at it. And what we're bringing is the whole industry together, attorneys, ICOs, advisors, platforms, everybody's coming together to have that conversation on a full day basis. And I think what I'm hoping out of this whole summit is that we're going to have more clarity as the way forward for the whole ICO token generation business, including the exchanges. The theme this year is the path to liquidity.
Yeah, with more clarity certainly does sound appealing. Howard, where can people find out more about what you do and keep up with your work?
Well, it's very simple. I have my own blog at howardmarks.com. My Twitter is @howardmarks. And you can also email me at hmarks@startengine.com.
And Sarah, how about you? How can people find out more about what you're up to?
So take a look at our website, which is crowdcheck.com. Specifically, take a look at our blog postings, which you can link to from there, and our educational resources, where we've got a bunch of memos and the like, including the most recent version of our discussion of the securities law aspects of ICOs. And if anybody wants to hear more, I am Sarah, SARA, at crowdcheck.com.
And Scott, how can people keep up with you?
Well, they can check out our website, primetrust.com, or they can read my blog on fundamerica.com. I've written quite a few blogs on ICOs and crypto, or they can email me. It's easy, scott@primetrust.com.
I recommend to all our listeners that you check out their work. I'd like to extend a huge thanks to our panelists for giving us an hour of their time. I personally learned a lot. I hope all of you listeners did as well. And thank you so much for joining us. We will be uploading a recording of this webinar to our website soon. And you'll be told when that is in case you want to listen to it again. And also please tell your friends and colleagues about this in case they missed this and would like to learn more about the regulatory minefield that is the initial coin offerings. Thank you all so much.
Thanks.
Thank you.